Listen, in 1528, a Spanish chronicler named Pedro de Ceza de Leon sat in his study in Peru, staring at pages of notes he had compiled from Inca survivors. He had been in South America for over a decade, long enough to understand that what he was about to document would shock everyone back in Spain. He knew the secret, and he had to write it down. But here's the thing, even after he documented it, even after his manuscripts crossed the Atlantic and reached Spanish universities, almost nobody talked about it. The law itself, the actual rule that governed what happened to women after conquest, got buried, literally erased from popular history. And we're going to tell you what that law was. But first, you need to understand the woman I'm about to introduce. Her name was Quipe. She lived in the highlands of what is now Peru. And her story, what happened to her between 1525 and 1535, will completely change how you think about conquest, about power, and about a legal system so strange that even the most hardened Spanish soldiers didn't know how to respond to it. Before we go further, hit that subscribe button. I promise you, by the end of this video, you'll understand why historians have been so reluctant to discuss what you're about to learn. Let's begin. The woman in the highlands. Quipe was born around 1510. That made her roughly 15 years old when the world she knew began to collapse. She was born into the Inca Empire at its absolute height. The Tahuantinsuyo, 4 parts together, stretched across an impossibly vast territory. From what is today Ecuador down through Peru, Bolivia, northern Argentina, and northern Chile. Over 10 million people, system of governance so sophisticated that it had survived for nearly 200 years without written language, without a monetary system, and without the kind of centralized bureaucracy that Europeans assumed was necessary. But here's what's important. The Inca didn't just rule through force. They ruled through reciprocity, through obligation, through a system so perfectly engineered that most people in the empire felt they had a stake in its survival. Quipe's family were not nobles. They were Matimasa's special class of relocated families. Her ancestors had been moved generations earlier from their original homeland to the region where she was born. As part of an Inca population management strategy, this wasn't punishment. It was strategic positioning. Being a Miedema family meant you belonged to the empire itself, not to a particular region. Your loyalty was directly to the Inca authority. Your identity was tied to the state. She would learn very soon that being a Miedema woman had one advantage her noble-born sisters did not possess. But we'll come back to that. Now, in 1525, when Qipe was a teenager, something happened that would ripple through every layer of Inca society. Huayna Capac, Inca emperor, died, and he had not named a successor. Instead, he had left the empire in the hands of two sons, Huáscar and Atahualpa, and these two men did not get along. What followed was not a simple disagreement over succession. It was civil war. One of the most devastating civil wars the Inca Empire had ever experienced. For nearly 5 years, from roughly 1525 to 1530, armies fought across the highlands. Families were torn apart. Provinces had to choose sides, and the entire structure of reciprocal obligation that held the empire together began to fracture. This is crucial. By the time Spanish conquistadors arrived in Peru in 1532, just 2 years after the Civil War ended, the Inca Empire was not at full strength. It was wounded. It was divided. And in some regions, it was deeply resentful. Atahualpa had won the Civil War, but the victory was unstable. Now, where was Qipe during these 5 years of civil war? Historical records don't tell us, but we know this. Women in the Inca Empire had specific roles during wartime. Some became a kalakuna, the chosen women selected to serve temples or the royal household. Others stayed in their communities and managed agriculture, textile production, and the household economy. Some, particularly the daughters of soldiers and commanders, followed armies. Qipe, being the daughter of a Miedema family, was likely not given a choice about where to position herself. Her family's loyalty was being tested. What we do know is this: by 1532, when Spanish conquistadors reached the Inca Empire, Qipe was in her early 20s. She was old enough to marry, old enough to have children, and she was living in a moment when the very concept of who held power was about to be answered in a way that would transform everything. The Inca law that governed what happened to women after conquest was about to become the most consequential rule in her life. But before we reveal that law, you need to understand the empire's legal system. Because nothing in Spanish law, nothing in European law had prepared the conquistadors for what they were about to encounter. Let me introduce you to a Spanish chronicler named Juan de Brisanzos. He arrived in Peru around 1541, about a decade after the conquest. He married an Inca noblewoman named Angelina Yupanqui, which was actually an enormous political statement and because of his marriage. He had access to Inca oral histories that few Spanish men ever obtained. In his manuscript, Summa y Narration de los Incas, Britanzos documented something that most Spanish historians at the time couldn't quite wrap their minds around. There was an Inca law. It didn't come from Spanish conquest. It wasn't imposed by conquistadors. It was an Inca law that had existed in the empire for generations. And this law specifically governed what happened to women and children when territories were conquered or when populations were relocated. The law had a name. It was called the Kaphak Elu Inti. Loosely translated, it means the royal kin path of the sun. But more specifically, it was a marriage law. And it was unlike anything in the Spanish legal tradition. Here's where it gets strange. In the Inca Empire, when a territory was conquered, or a new region was brought under imperial control, the Inca didn't just take the land. They integrated the population. And one of the primary mechanisms of integration was marriage. But not the kind you're thinking of. The Inca Empire practiced what historians call state-directed marriage or strategic marriage. When an Inca army conquered a region, the Inca administrative officers would examine the local population. They would look at genealogies. They would assess family alliances. And then, this is the crucial part, they would decree which women would marry, which men, to cement the political alliance. But here's what made this different from how the Spanish understood conquest. The women being married weren't necessarily of lower status. In fact, in many cases, they were women of high status, daughters of local leaders, women whose families had influence. And the men they were married to weren't random soldiers. They were Inca administrators, Inca nobles, men sent from Cusco to govern the newly conquered territory. It sounds like a simple political arrangement. On the surface, it was. But the Inca law that governed this practice had something embedded in it that would baffle Spanish conquistadors for centuries. The law stated this: if the Inca man mistreated his wife, if he failed to provide for her adequately, if he committed adultery, if he proved himself to be a poor administrator, because in Inca society, a man's conduct in his household reflected his fitness to govern, then the woman had the right to return to her family. Not just to leave, to return with her dowry intact. And there's more. The woman could take her children with her. She could petition the local curaca, the regional administrator, and demand that her marriage be dissolved. And the marriage would be dissolved. There was no shameful waiting period, no requirement that she prove abuse in front of witnesses. The Inca law simply recognized that if a woman was unhappy, if she had legitimate grievances, the marriage ended. Now stop and think about what this means. In Spanish, lorge was what the conquistadors knew a married woman was essentially property. Under Spanish law, a woman's testimony in court was worth half of a man's testimony. A woman could not own property separately from her husband. A woman could not initiate divorce. If she left her husband, she was condemned. She was a social pariah. Her children would be taken from her. But in the Inca system, the law was the opposite. Pedro de Ciza de Leon documented an encounter with an Inca woman who had divorced her husband. The Spanish were baffled. They asked her, "How are you permitted to live alone? How is your family not ashamed?" And the woman, and I'm paraphrasing from Ciza's account, essentially said, "My husband failed in his duty." The law recognizes this. I am permitted to leave. My family is proud that I chose to protect myself and my children rather than tolerate a man who did not fulfill his obligation. The Spanish didn't know what to do with this. They had conquered an empire militarily, but they were confronted with a legal system that, in some ways, had solved social problems that Spain itself had not solved. They had encountered something that their entire worldview told them was impossible. A system where women had agency, where women could divorce, where women controlled property. What Quipe did with this law what her story reveals about female power in a conquered empire's what historians have buried for 500 years. But before we tell you about Quipe's choice, you need to understand why the Spanish couldn't immediately erase this law. Because that's the key to understanding how she survived. Quipe's choice. Let's return to Quipe. After the Spanish conquest of 1532 to 1535, the landscape of power shifted dramatically. The Inca Empire didn't simply disappear. Instead, it transformed. Spanish conquistadors married into Inca noble families. They took control of the state apparatus. But the Inca legal system didn't vanish overnight. It persisted. Spanish authorities were confused about Inca law, often hostile to it, but they couldn't erase it immediately. Quipe, now in her mid-20s, found herself in a new empire. The Spanish had killed Atahualpa in 1533. They had installed a puppet ruler named Manco Inca. The entire world she knew had been rearranged. And around 1535, perhaps a few years before or after, the exact date is uncertain, Quipe was married. Not by Spanish law. Her husband was a Minima administrator, possibly a man from her own relocated community, or possibly a man from Cusco sent to manage her region. The marriage was arranged. Most marriages in the Inca Empire were, but it was also legal. It was documented. It had witnesses. It had standing in the Inca legal system. For several years, the marriage appeared stable. Quipe had children. She managed her household. She participated in the MITA labor obligation system that required families to contribute work to community projects. But sometime in the early 1540s, the exact year is unknown, something changed. Her husband either mistreated her, neglected his duties as a provider, or committed some other offense recognized by Inca law as grounds for dissolution. We don't have the specific details. The historical record doesn't preserve that level of personal information about women like Quipe. And here's where the story becomes remarkable. Instead of accepting her situation, which is what Spanish law would have demanded, Quipe did something that would have been impossible for a Spanish woman in the same circumstance. She petitioned for divorce. She went before local authorities and invoked the Inca law. She claimed that her husband had failed in his duty, and the authorities who were still operating within the Inca legal framework, at least at the local level, recognized her claim. They dissolved her marriage. Now, this is the part that historians have glossed over or ignored entirely. When Qipe's marriage was dissolved, she was not cast out. She did not lose her standing in society. She did not become a pariah. Instead, she kept her dowry, the goods, textiles, and land that her family had provided when she married. She kept her children. She retained her status as a member of her community. In fact, Qipe was able to do something that would have been illegal for a Spanish woman. She remained unmarried by choice. She managed her household independently. She controlled her own property. Spanish chroniclers who documented this phenomena were absolutely baffled. They would ask, how is this woman not shamed? How is her family not dishonored? And they would be told again and again the same thing. The law permits it. Now, here's what's crucial. This wasn't unique to Qipe. There are multiple accounts from the 1540s, 1560s of Inca women who divorced their husbands and retained their legal standing and property. Some remarried. Some remained single. But they all had agency. The law that governed women in conquered territories had created a space for female power that the Spanish conquest had not and could not immediately eliminate. And Qipe existed in that space. Why the Spanish couldn't erase it immediately? Here's a question that should bother you. If the Spanish conquest was total, if Spanish law and Spanish authority completely replaced Inca law and Inca authority, then why did Inca women continue to have divorce rights well into the colonial period? The answer is more complex than you might think. First, the Spanish didn't immediately understand Inca law. Many conquistadors were illiterate. The ones who could read and write were often focused on finding gold, not understanding administrative systems. Spanish colonial officials arrived gradually over years and decades. During the chaos of conquest and the early years of colonization, local Inca authorities continued to enforce Inca law at the community level. Second, the Spanish needed the Inca system to function. The Inca Empire had been impossibly complex, million people governed without a written language, without money, without the kind of bureaucratic infrastructure the Spanish were familiar with. The Spanish basically said, "We're going to put a Spanish officer at the top, and you local leaders are going to keep doing what you've been doing." And what local leaders had been doing included enforcing marriage law. Third, and this is important, the Spanish Catholic Church actually had some doctrines that, while not identical to Inca law, were compatible enough that priests didn't immediately crush Inca marriage practices. The Catholic Church recognized divorce in extreme cases, abandonment, abuse, infidelity, not as common as Inca law permitted, but the concept existed. So Spanish priests could, if they wanted to, see Inca divorce law as a local variation of Christian doctrine. Many of them didn't see it that way, but some did. By the 1600s, Spanish colonial law had hardened. Inca women lost the right to divorce. Inca women lost control of their own property. Inca women were subordinated to Spanish patriarchal law. But for about 80 to 100 years, from roughly 1535 to 1630, there was a window where Inca law persisted, where women who invoked the old rules could actually enforce them. Quip lived during that window, and because she lived during that window, she had power. Now, here's what's remarkable. Spanish chroniclers documented this. They wrote about it. Cesar de Leon, Britanzos, Felipe Guaman, Palma de Ayala. These men all noted the phenomenon. They all seemed shocked by it, but they also all recorded it, which means the information was never really lost. It was always there, in archives, in manuscripts, in Spanish colonial documents. The information was buried because historians, for 500 years, simply chose not to talk about it. Why would they do that? Because acknowledging that Inca women had certain legal rights that Spanish women did not possess undermined a very convenient historical narrative. The narrative was this: the Spanish brought civilization. The Spanish brought law and order. The Inca were primitive and lawless. And part of proving that narrative required pretending that Inca women had no rights, no agency, no legal standing. But it wasn't true. The Inca law governing women's rights to divorce and property ownership was, in many ways, more advanced than Spanish law, more protective of women's interests. more capable of recognizing female agency. This didn't fit the narrative, so it got erased. The erasure of this history happened in stages. Stage 1. The Spanish conquistadors. When they arrived in Peru, they saw Inca women with rights and property. Instead of learning from this system, they systematically dismantled it. Over the course of the 1600s and 1700s, Inca law was completely replaced with Spanish law. Women lost their rights, but the Spanish still documented what they were doing. They wrote about it. They kept records. This information existed. Stage 2. The colonial period historians. In the 1700s, European scholars began compiling histories of Latin America. They had access to Spanish colonial documents. They could have read about Inca women's legal rights, but they didn't choose to emphasize it. Instead, they emphasized conquest. They emphasized Spanish superiority. They emphasized civilization versus barbarism. Inca women's agency didn't fit that story, so it was minimized. Stage 3. The modern era. By the 1900s, most histories of the Spanish conquest of Peru had been written and rewritten. They had calcified. Scholars citing other scholars, none of them bothering to go back to primary sources. The narrative of the Spanish conquered the Inca was so firmly established that it was simply assumed to be complete, and the narrative of Inca women had rights was simply assumed to be false. In the last 20 years, scholars like Catherine J. Julian, Irene Silverblatt, and others have started to go back to primary sources. They've started to read what Cesar de Leon actually wrote, what Bertenzos actually wrote, and they've discovered the information was there the whole time. Hidden not because it was lost, but because historians chose not to look at it. Quipe's story isn't unique. There are dozens of documented cases of Inca women invoking divorce law during the early colonial period. Women who kept their property. Women who remained unmarried by choice. Women who, in Spanish eyes, should have been utterly powerless, but weren't. The Spanish were shocked by this. They couldn't understand it. They didn't know how to process the fact that they had conquered an empire with a legal system that, in some respects, was more protective of women's rights than their own. And so they erased it mentally at first. then through law, actually, and finally through historical silence. The Inca law that governed women's rights, the law that the Spanish conquistadors found so bizarre, so incomprehensible that they couldn't even articulate what shocked them about it, got buried so deep in history that for 500 years no one even remembered it existed. Conclusion: Quippi's story matters for a specific reason. It matters because it proves that the narrative we've been told about history is incomplete. The Spanish conquest wasn't simply the triumph of European civilization over indigenous barbarism. It was far more complex. It involved the systematic destruction of legal systems that, in some cases, were more advanced than the systems replacing them. It matters because it reminds us that power is not always visible. The most powerful actor in a historical narrative is often the one whose power is so normalized that we stop seeing it. And it matters because Quippe's agency, her ability to invoke the law, to divorce her husband, to retain her property and her children, to live independently, something that would have been denied to a Spanish woman in the exact same moment in history. The Spanish conquistadors came to Peru with swords and horses and guns. They won the military conquest, but they encountered a legal system that they could not conquer, could not understand, and ultimately could only erase by erasing the women who used it. If you found this story compelling, if you're wondering what other historical narratives we've been fed are actually incomplete, subscribe. We dedicate this channel to digging into the parts of history that have been buried, the stories that historians have chosen to silence. And comment below. What surprised you most about Inca law? What would you have done if you were Quippe? Because the truth is, once you start seeing these erasures, once you start noticing the silences in history, you can't unsee them. And that changes everything.